Welcome to Insightful Agenda, where we dive deep into the world's most pressing issues. Today we're exploring a concept that affects your life more than you might think: financialization. We're breaking it down to show you how it works, why it's dangerous, and why we should all be paying attention. To help us understand this complex topic, we'll be drawing from Grace Blakeley's book. This book provides a sharp analysis of how financialization is reshaping economies, and not for the better. So, what exactly is financialization? In simple terms, it refers to the increasing dominance of financial motives, markets, and institutions in shaping the entire economy. But what does that really mean? In the past, economies were driven by industry, factories, workers, and the production of goods. But starting in the late 20th century, we saw a shift. Economies started to revolve around finance, banking, stock markets, and corporate profits driven by financial speculation rather than actual production. Blakeley defines financialization as the increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors, and financial institutions in the operation of domestic and international economies. Financialization shifts the focus from producing things that have value to creating value through financial instruments and debt. This means that finance has become central to nearly every aspect of our lives, from how businesses operate, to how governments borrow money, to how households manage debt. And that's where the problems begin. To understand why financialization is dangerous, let's break down how it operates in three key areas: corporations, households, and governments. Let's start with corporations. In the past, companies focused on making goods and services. Their goal was long-term growth through reinvestment in production. But financialization changed that. Today, many corporations are more concerned with their share price than with investing in new products or workers. They take on debt to buy back their own stock, inflate their value, and distribute massive profits to shareholders. This is what Blakeley calls the financialization of the corporation. Take the case of Toys R Us. Private equity firms bought the company, loaded it with debt, and extracted profits for themselves. Meanwhile, Toys R Us was unable to innovate or compete, eventually going bankrupt and costing 33,000 employees their jobs. Next, let's talk about households. As Blakeley explains, financialization didn't stop at corporations. It found its way into our homes. In the past, families relied on wages and savings to build their future. Today, people are drowning in debt, whether it's credit cards, mortgages, or student loans. Blakeley describes this as privatized Keynesianism, a system where, instead of the government driving economic growth through public investment, households are encouraged to take on debt to fuel consumption. This makes everyday people vulnerable to financial crises and dependent on the health of the financial markets. Let's take a quick detour and understand the 2008 financial crisis in detail. The 2008 financial crisis, where banks aggressively pushed subprime mortgages on people who couldn't afford them. When the housing bubble burst, millions lost their homes while the banks got bailed out. The 2008 financial crisis was one of the most catastrophic events in modern history, and it highlights the dangers of financialization. As Grace Blakeley explains, the crisis was not an isolated event, it was the inevitable result of a financialized economy. Before the crash, the U.S. housing market was booming. Banks were handing out subprime mortgages to borrowers who couldn't afford them. But why would banks take such risky bets? It's because they no longer cared whether the loans would be repaid. Thanks to financialization, these loans were packaged into complex financial products called mortgage-backed securities, MBS, which were then sold to investors. By bundling risky mortgages into MBS and selling them, banks spread the risk across the entire global financial system. They were making huge profits without worrying about the long-term consequences. As Blakeley puts it, financialization shifted the focus from real investment to speculation. When house prices started falling, borrowers couldn't keep up with their mortgage payments, and the financial products built on those loans, like MBS, became worthless. Lehman Brothers, heavily invested in these toxic assets, collapsed in September 2008, triggering a global financial meltdown. The collapse of Lehman Brothers wasn't just the failure of one bank, it was the collapse of an entire system built on debt and speculation. The human cost was enormous. Millions of people lost their homes and unemployment soared. In the U.S., over 10 million families faced foreclosure. Meanwhile, governments around the world bailed out the very banks that caused the crisis. Blakeley argues that the 2008 crisis exposed the true nature of financialized capitalism. While ordinary people suffered, the financial elite were rescued. Governments spent trillions bailing out banks, but the root causes of the crisis were left untouched. Why it happened. Financialization at the core. The 2008 crisis wasn't a random disaster, it was the direct result of financialization. Banks prioritized short-term profits over long-term stability, creating a fragile system built on debt. When the bubble burst, it wasn't just the banks that fell, it was the global economy. Blakeley said, "Financialization turns the economy into a casino, where profit is made not through production, but through speculation." The 2008 crash was a direct result of this shift. Even today, the effects of the 2008 crisis linger. Economic inequality has worsened, and governments, instead of reining in finance, have doubled down on austerity, cutting public services while ensuring financial markets continue to thrive. The 2008 financial crisis was a warning, a clear example of how financialization destabilizes economies, deepens inequality, and leaves ordinary people to pick up the pieces. As Blakeley warns, if we don't address the power of finance, we risk another collapse, one that could be even worse. C. Financialization of the state. Finally, let's look at governments. Financialization has even reshaped how states function. Governments, particularly since the 1980s, have increasingly relied on private finance to fund public projects. As Grace Blakeley notes, Margaret Thatcher's Private Finance Initiative, PFI, in the UK is a perfect example. Instead of investing public money into infrastructure projects, the government invited private companies to build and manage things like schools and hospitals, all in exchange for long-term payments. This ended up transferring billions of taxpayer money to private investors, while leaving the state in massive debt. Now that we understand how financialization works, let's explore why it's dangerous. There are four main reasons. First, financialization increases economic inequality. As corporations and wealthy investors use financial markets to make enormous profits, ordinary people fall further behind. Blakeley explains that the rise of financialized capitalism has led to a trickle-up economy, where the wealth flows upwards to the top 1%, leaving the majority with stagnant wages and growing debt. Second, financialization makes economies more unstable. By prioritizing short-term profits, financial markets encourage speculation and bubbles. And when those bubbles burst, it's ordinary people who pay the price. As we saw in the 2008 crash, financialization creates a system that's prone to boom and bust cycles, and the next crash could be just around the corner. Third, financialization undermines democracy. When governments are more concerned with pleasing financial markets than their own citizens, democracy suffers. Policies like austerity, which cuts public spending to reduce debt, hurt the most vulnerable while protecting the financial elite. Finally, financialization is accelerating environmental destruction. In the relentless pursuit of profit, financialized corporations extract natural resources and pollute the planet with no regard for sustainability. As Blakeley argues, financialization is a system that extracts value today at the expense of future generations, and the environment is paying the ultimate price. Section 4. How did we get here? So, how did financialization come to dominate our lives? According to Blakeley, it didn't happen overnight. It was the result of deliberate political and economic choices. The rise of neoliberalism. In the 1980s, political leaders like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan introduced neoliberal policies that deregulated financial markets, cut taxes for the wealthy, and reduced public investment. These policies unleashed financial markets and shifted power from workers to the wealthy elite. Blakeley says, the neoliberal era marked the dismantling of the institutions that once restrained finance, paving the way for its unchecked growth. The globalization of finance. Globalization also played a key role. As capital became more mobile across borders, governments competed to attract investment by further deregulating their economies. This gave financial institutions even more power to shape global policies. So what's the solution? Blakeley argues that we need to reverse financialization by democratizing finance, redistributing wealth, and investing in public infrastructure. We must challenge the power of financial markets and put the well-being of people and the planet above short-term profits. Financialization may seem like an abstract concept, but it's shaping every part of our world. If we want a fairer, more stable, and sustainable future, it's time to act. Please consider liking this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe for more insights and videos that make you think.